Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Christian Horner does not seem convinced that Red Bull will dominate the upcoming F1 season in the same way we've just seen here in 2023, mainly because of what occurred back in 2021. Mercedes had a dominant W11 in the 2020 season, Red Bull closed the gap and even won the Drivers' Championship in the following year. Horner reckons the same thing could happen again, and Mercedes are due to close the gap to the Red Bull RB20 in the upcoming season. Many saying no, different set of circumstances back then, there were regulation changes, not the case today. Are Red Bull going to dominate if they don't make some sort of error? Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. Plenty to get into. Firstly, we've got to mention this, if we go full screen for a second, from Max Verstappen's former trainer, Bradley Scanes, now 4 years alongside Verstappen, and this is kind of incredible. 368 flights they took over the last 4 years that they've been working together, and I mean, that's just absurd, and this is how it goes right now with Formula 1, adding more and more races. For a lot of the guys that are there behind the scenes that don't get all the plaudits that the drivers get, the operations guys, performance managers, etc, and sure, I'm sure he gets to go on the lovely Verstappen private jet flying everywhere, but still, it's loads of different time zones. Russell was making a big point about this over the last couple of days as well, saying that he has so many mechanics who are ill, people in the engineer's office just struggling with the constant time zone shifts. I mean, let's be honest here. We went from Vegas to Abu Dhabi one weekend after another, and okay, sure, they only race on the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, at least the drivers do, but right at the start of the week on the Tuesday, everyone's getting there. They're setting things up. So much preparation work goes in, and the drivers probably have it easier than anybody. That's actually what Russell says. The drivers, we have it the best from every single person in the paddock. The way we travel, we're in a very fortunate position, but everybody up and down the paddock, especially because some of the engineers and mechanics and stuff, they're flying in, economy class on the jets and stuff. They don't have so much of the luxuries that many of the drivers do. The way we travel, very fortunate position. I've got so many mechanics who are ill, people struggling, the body not knowing where you are, eating at different times, staying in different hotels, different environments, different climates. I think the eating is a big thing as well when you're traveling. Getting the right food in, it's a bit of a nightmare. The body is getting confused. I think there are talks for next year about personnel being regulated that they can't do every single race. And this would be very interesting if this is the case. The Russell is saying, look, maybe it's for the better that we actually say to the teams, hey, all of these staff, they can't come to every race. They have to alternate, don't do so many. We know that the likes of Helmut Marko and even Toto Wolff have said that they don't really want to be doing 24 races a year. They'd be happy to do 18, 20, maybe they can push it to 22, but there's a couple a year that I think a lot of the staff will miss going forwards, and totally understandable from the mechanics and that point of view as well. I mean, the conditions that they're all subject to, the drivers especially, but, mechanics and engineers as well in Qatar, for example, and then, next weekend, probably an entirely different country, different time zone, especially next year. I think that is it a triple header at the end of the season with I don't know if it's Qatar, Vegas, Abu Dhabi, or whether it's I don't know, I think it's Las Vegas, Abu Dhabi right to the end of the year in a bit of a triple header. Yeah, so here you go. Next year, Vegas, 23rd of November, then the next weekend, Qatar, the weekend after that, Abu Dhabi. So, that is not going to be easy on all involved. Now, yesterday we talked about Ferrari and the rumours about potential contract renewals. No doubt that Leclerc will stay. If he wants to stay, they will for sure keep him. Question is, what about Carlos Sainz? John Elkann, president at Ferrari, says that certainly they will stay at Ferrari going forwards. Now, sure, they will certainly stay for the upcoming season. We know that they're signed for 2024. What about 2025? No contract yet locked in that position. I think it does depend to some degree on what happens going forwards. Sainz, of course, has been linked to Audi. As I said yesterday, would I be surprised if they kept both of these drivers? No. Very strong driver pairing. They seem to get on reasonably well, considering the fact that they are quite closely matched generally over the course of the last couple of seasons, really, and even back in 2021, for example, as well. But if Sainz was to stay at Ferrari for 2025, it would probably lock down the driver market somewhat, because technically, we think we know that Hamilton and Russell will stay at Mercedes for the time being until you would expect at least 2026, 2027 that to be the case on the current evidence. So Ferrari, if Leclerc and Sainz are going to stay there going into 2025, then they might stay for 26. Who knows? Maybe it's going to be Audi for Sainz at that point. I guess we'll see. Red Bull is still going to be Verstappen +1. Might be Verstappen, Ricciardo. And then it depends really on whether other top seats arrive, whether McLaren or Aston Martin can stay good, or somehow like Alpine get good. But yeah, why have I even mentioned that? It's Alpine. But still, for the likes of Alex Albon, he's been a driver that's been linked to Ferrari, linked to maybe other teams. Of course, we know that Norris might have been linked to Red Bull as well. So some interesting developments, I think, in the driver market if Sainz is to stay beyond 2024, because that seat at Ferrari wouldn't be available to even a top-performing F2 driver, let's say a Behrman who's in the Ferrari project, or even an Alex Albon to go there as well, even though he has some history, I'm pretty sure, with Fred Vasseur. The Mercedes seats are probably locked down. The second Red Bull seat is very much available, though, I think, and Ricciardo maybe, even possibly Norris or others could be a thing, and then if Norris was to go to Red Bull, then that would leave a seat at McLaren. So doors might open, but I think that if Sainz was to leave Ferrari, that would seriously open the door to a changing of the guard in so many different teams in 2025. But if Sainz stays at Ferrari, that might lock down other potential moves as well. I'm just hoping that we have some drama in next year's, silly season, because this year we really didn't have too much. Let's talk about Red Bull though. This was the extent of their dominance this season. Only Ferrari got a victory in Singapore. Of course, that weekend it was a Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes podium. Verstappen was in the end P5, I believe. And that, of course, the only race in the season that Verstappen did not finish on the podium. Mercedes have said, other teams have said, they are effectively entirely redesigning their car. The only way they can attempt to try and compete with the RB20 next year is to take a big risk, and hopefully it works out as far as Mercedes are concerned. Ferrari will have to do a similar thing. McLaren are probably a bit more confident just because, they've moved in a good direction, they've made significant progress, but there's still a few things they lack compared to what Red Bull have, especially on tracks with, slower corners and stuff. They tend to struggle a little bit more, so probably if you had to put money on who's going to get P2 in next year's constructors, you'd probably say Mercedes again, given the fact that they got it this year with a bit of a Frankenstein of a car. They'll probably get it next year as well. Assuming, though, that is, the Red Bull win again. Hamilton says he's hopeful that they can close the gap, Mercedes, but he's not going to hold his breath, and I don't think anyone really should. However, Christian Horner has tried to open the possibility that the RB20 could be caught up to, and even Pierre Vacher here of Red Bull says the RB19 failed, in some sense, that only Verstappen could handle it. Let's be honest, though, this has been a feature of Red Bull cars for quite some time, and newie cars in general. They are incredibly fast for a driver that can handle the requirements of the car. But for drivers that can't do that so much, especially in qualifying, Checo Perez's average qualifying position this year it's got to be worse than 8th. It might be about 10th. I don't know. It's got to be bad. And I don't think he qualified on the front row since Miami. And I don't think he was in the top 3 since he was top 5 very rarely for a large part of the season. And, that goes to show, sure, Perez wasn't performing well, couldn't really handle the car, confidence, etc., etc. But also, it says something a little bit about the car. It's the reason why people often say, oh, the car's built for Max, or the car's built for Seb, or, whoever. I think it's just generally the way that Newey and the team designs their cars tends to suit a driver of the talent that can handle that really well. And if they do decide, all right, Max, you want a bit more front end, here you go, it just completely kills, the other driver with a different driving style. Now, whether they can fix that for next year, I doubt it, because this is just how Red Bull operate. So you've got to know, if you're going in there as the Red Bull second driver, you've either got to be as talented as Sebastian Vettel or Max Verstappen, or good luck, basically, handling the car. On the other hand, we in turn may not have understood Checo well in terms of what he needs to be able to get the potential out of the RB19 as well. We know that Checo said, hey guys, can we go back to the old spec version of the car? And they said, no, we ain't doing that. Unlucky Checo, you could use this version. You can get absolutely crushed every single weekend. But the RB20, maybe they will think, all right, maybe we need to help Perez a bit more. Let's do this, let's do that. Let's give Perez something that he likes. I doubt they'll do this, but I think that realistically, the only way Red Bull don't just dominate next season is if they make a mistake. We've heard rumours that Newey has this new idea for the floor that they want to do, that they think they can make another big step, and if that works, just chalk it up. You know what I mean? We've got another Verstappen domination season. But if they get it wrong, then there's a possibility. But I just think that on paper, the idea that anyone anyone can catch up to Red Bull seems a very tall order, but Horner says that it's possible. Now, I think that Horner is, again, it might be a bit of hot air here from Christian Horner, and we know that, let's say when the cost cap penalty came through, he was, oh my God, it's so draconian, it's going to, kill a whole season. I can't believe they would do something so devastating. And yeah, we didn't really see much evidence of it, did we? But Horner says that it's possible Red Bull will be caught next season, even maybe it's quite likely based on what occurred back in 2021. Of course, we know in 2020, Mercedes had probably of the entire turbo hybrid era, their best car, the Mercedes W12. It's still the fastest Formula One car ever and probably will remain that way for a rather long time to come. But at the end of that season, going into 2021, Red Bull were able to catch and certainly overtake at the start of 2021. They had the stronger car at the end. Mercedes fought back, and we know how that championship ended. Still, Mercedes did win the constructors that year, maybe just because Bottas was better than Perez was. But whatever you think, it was, a classic season for the ages with lots of drama. So Horner says 2020, Mercedes had a dominant car. 2021, all of a sudden, we were able to beat them. Now, there was, as he says, a subtle rule change. I would say that it was maybe a little bit more than subtle, but he says, look, competitors are coming closer, different venues, I'm sure concepts will converge, and basically he says that based on 2021, then Mercedes or somebody else will be able to catch Red Bull this season. I doubt this somewhat, especially because there's a bit more to this than meets the eye. Next year, the regulations are, for all intents and purposes, the same as this year. Whereas going into 2021, it was quite clear that at that point, at the end of that turbo hybrid era, or at least the first stint of the turbo hybrid era before we've now gone back to ground effect, the FIA would try what they could to try and stop Mercedes. They won all these championships in a row. There was a clear intention to stop Mercedes in certain ways. Party mode, for example. DAS, that was another big one. And then the big one really was the floor design that definitely affected the lower rate concept of Mercedes more so than it did the higher rate concept of the Red Bull. And those three things combined led to a very competitive car. And let's be honest, led to an incredibly competitive season. Now, to be fair as well, in Abu Dhabi 2020, Hamilton had COVID or whatever, he was unwell. Verstappen won that race though. Honda made improvements. Red Bull were making steps. So it was quite clear that Red Bull were closer to Mercedes at the end of 2020 than they were previously and that people maybe expected them to be. So, just looking at all the evidence here, a few regulation changes that helped Red Bull over Mercedes going into 2021, the fact that Red Bull actually were pretty close to Mercedes anyway at the end of 2020, all that together created a competitive season. This time, we don't have any of that really. We don't have anyone that can get close to Red Bull at the end of the season. Maybe McLaren, but even that's a bit of a stretch. It's not like they won a race, let's be honest. In Abu Dhabi, McLaren were kind of nowhere, really. Mercedes were quite a long way off the pace. Leclerc was P2, but, 17 seconds behind Max in P1 in a Red Bull that hadn't been upgraded for months. So it just seems rather unlikely. And I feel like this is kind of a classic thing for Horner to say. In addition to the fact that, as Hamilton says, from their evidence, from the data that they've looked at, Verstappen was most of the time just chilling and not really pushing, managing tyres, not even breaking a sweat, as he says here. Even when we chased him in Austin, I don't think he was sweating. I think he was just able to control it. You go through the lap times and some of the data for Max, he is just chilling at the front more often than not. I don't think he's broken a sweat during the year. And when you're in position that you've got the performance, you can back off, the car goes further, the tyres go longer, you're in a sweet spot. It's amazing to be in that place. Hamilton has experienced it, but ultimately they've done a great job. But that's the thing, right? How much more pace did Max have? It was a point that Russell made right at the start of the season. He said I think it was even pre-Australia, but certainly after Australia, he said, look, they've won every race so far. They're looking good to win every single race in the season. They eventually didn't, but they got very close, let's be honest. It was only Singapore that stood in between that actually occurring in the end. And saying that Verstappen's basically sandbagging. He's got way more pace, and they simply don't want to show it. And, so adding all the information up, maybe Mercedes or McLaren or Ferrari could challenge Red Bull next season if there were some regulation changes to slow down Red Bull, if somebody at the end of the season had shown to be particularly competitive. But we haven't seen any of that, so it's tough to really show the parallel between this upcoming year and 2021 because we just don't have as many parallels. This kind of comes back to the point I made earlier where I just don't see it being feasibly possible that anybody catches Red Bull Bull unless Red Bull themselves make a mistake. Like, Mercedes might build a great car next year, but if Red Bull make a good step on the RB19, as they say that they will, then, like, good luck, you know? Like, how are you meant to get close to what they've achieved in terms of consistency? The remarkable thing about the Red Bull is it's just good everywhere. Like, the McLaren is competitive with the Red Bull at certain tracks, was probably faster in Qatar this year, let's be honest. Like, probably they'd have won that race if they didn't start and have a bad qualifying, start further back on the grid. And there are a few races where Max was, you know, somewhat vulnerable, but it's like every corner type, every track, the Red Bull is going to be fast, and it's probably going to be fastest. It's so difficult for anyone else to get close to that with the weaknesses of their respective cars. It's just tough to imagine that they can achieve that, Mercedes or anybody else, unless Red Bull, you know, take a risk and it backfires, which apparently they are doing. But, you know, do you think that Newey and Vashi and their team will have something that backfires? Doubtful. So I think the Horner is probably just saying this because, well, it makes it sound better. It makes it sound like we're going to have a more competitive season than we might otherwise do, but who knows? Maybe we'll be surprised. Just to finish out the season, though, with this I thought was interesting, and finish out the video with this some F-data analysis on the number of overtakes on average in every Formula 1 season. You know, overtaking doesn't always correlate to entertainment value. It does to some degree, and we saw that really going into like 2006, 2007, there wasn't much overtaking. Now, I feel like part of this was because back in the day, there was so much delta between the cars. Like, the cars today, at least in qualifying, are very competitive. Like, this is the closest season we've ever had this most recent year in terms of P1 to P10 car in qualifying performance. For so many years, there was such a delta that, like, the faster cars would just start in front, and therefore there would be less overtaking anyway. Now, when DRS was introduced, obviously overtaking goes up, doesn't it? No surprises there. When the wider cars happened in like 2017, basically, overtaking went down. Ground effect has maybe helped somewhat, as has DRS, obviously, as has, to be honest, Perez qualifying out of position because he did lots of overtaking this year. But on average, there were more than 50 overtakes per race this season, largely helped by Netherlands being an absolute joke, right, in those first couple of laps. But I thought it was interesting data to look at how things have changed over time. Does that necessarily mean that things are more entertaining now than they used to be? Well, that's another debate to be had. But hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.